Hello everyone, Mela here with Mattea. Um, First off, I hope everyone had a good Christmas and that you did not get trampled during the insanity that was Boxing Day. With that out of the way, Mattea is here with me because I've actually figured out some more things about her story, and her background and the world she's from, and also between the relationship between her and Nagisa, my ice sprite. So first things first, Mattea is from an alternate world. Not to be confused with the alternate world that Alwyn and Ethel are from, which is 1930s with magic, some elements of the 20s and the 40s. Mattea here is from an alternate world that is essentially set in the now. She does have the laptop. She has, she's electricity, running water, internet, all those wonderful things. But what makes her world different from ours is that in her world, Newfoundland is separate from Canada. Okay, little history lesson for all non-Canadians, and a little refresher for the Canadians. Newfoundland was actually a separate colony and a separate independent country from Canada up until after the Second World War. Essentially what happened was that after the First World War, Newfoundland lost a whole score of their young men. And after the Second World War, that was even worse. And essentially what happened was that Britain was not in position anymore to be able to support Newfoundland, which is an island that's its main source of income was fishing. So when you lose a lot of those young men who were going to be fishermen, that's a big problem. And long story short, there ended up being a referendum where they asked all Newfoundlanders of voting age to answer a simple yes or no question. Should Newfoundland join the Canadian Confederation? And the yeses narrowly beat out the noes, and that's how we got Newfoundland as our last province. Not last territory, but last province. In Mattea's world, the noes narrowly beat out the yeses, and so Newfoundland stayed separate and independent. Fast forward to modern day, Newfoundland is still separate in her world, but the relationship between Newfoundland and Canada is a bit like the relationship between Liechtenstein and Switzerland. There's a lot of cooperation, a lot of sharing of resources, and basically in her world, what is that Canada is sort of supporting Newfoundland, because Newfoundland is still the entire island where she's from is basically very rural. It's kind of stuck in a bit of a time warp, and that's part of the reason why so many of the young people leave to go to the mainland, aka Canada. Mattea's the exception. She actually doesn't want to leave to go to the mainland, but she is very much the exception. Anyway, also big difference in her world, there is still cod. They didn't have the cod collapse that we had in our world, which was absolutely horrible for Newfoundland's economy. In Mattea, where Mattea is from, basically there was conservation efforts that have been in place for quite a long time, and that's the only reason they still have the cod stocks. But there is a very strict quota system for, how many you can bring in per boat, per day, what times you can do it. It's all very, very regulated, because they do not want cod to disappear, which, if any of you know, was absolutely catastrophic, for both Newfoundland and for Canada when the cod disappeared. So that was kind of one of the big sources of revenue. Anyway, enough about that. And it's actually through one of these conservation efforts that Mattea's parents met. Mattea's father, John, let's call him because I don't actually have a name for him. So let's call him John. Went over to an environmental and conservation conference in Copenhagen, and it was there that he met Mattea's mother. They kept meeting up at all these different conferences all over Europe and in Newfoundland and in Canada, and they fell in love, and they got married, and they moved back to John's hometown, which is more of a village, very small, bit far away from pretty much everything, and it worked out for the first couple of years. Mattea's parents have since divorced. Living a small town rural life was not a fit for Mattea's mother, and as much as her parents are still fond of one another, and as much as they love their daughter, they weren't in love with each other anymore. So they've stayed friends, but Mattea's mother has since moved back to Denmark. But there's kind of a funny story behind why Mattea's name is Mattea, which is an old-fashioned name and quite unusual, even in the world that she's from. She's the only Mattea that she knows, and even in the cities, not just the towns, but even in the cities, it's a really unusual name. So I was thinking, well, why would her parents name her that if it's so strange and old-fashioned, and uncommon? Well, it goes back to one very important thing. Everyone was expecting that Mattea would be a boy. Everyone. From her parents, to the doctors, to everyone in the village, essentially. The village that she's from kind of acts like they're an extremely large extended family. Everyone knows everyone somehow. And there's kind of like 2 degrees of separation. Like it's pretty immediate. It isn't just, oh yeah, I went to school with them. It's, oh, I went to school with them and my father fishes on the same boat as his father, and our hairdresser is our neighbor's cousin. Like very immediate connections between everyone. So, and as you can imagine, in a small town, there isn't a lot of excitement. There isn't a lot of little kids running around. So everyone kind of gets in everyone's faces whenever there's a child that's going to be born. So everyone is expecting that the Rogers were going to have a son. And everyone was expecting it so much that Mattea's parents had actually already picked out what name it was going to be. Their son's name was going to be Mattea Rogers, because mother wanted her son to have a name that reflected his heritage. Well, Mattea is born. Obviously does not have boy parts, which is a big problem, because everyone was so certain she would be a boy that they hadn't picked out any possible girl names. So for 2 weeks, she is known as just the child, the baby, the little one, the girl, with absolutely no name. And how she ends up getting her name is that her grandmother comes in from outside of town, takes one look at the child and goes, Matthias, I know a girl name that sounds like that. And of course the parents go, what? Like, please tell us. And that is how Mattea gets her name. Her name is given to her by her grandmother, who is a very important figure in her life. And when Mattea's story kind of starts up, it's a few months after her, well, it's about 8 months after her grandmother has passed away. Another important note about the world she's from, or more specifically the village she's from. As much as it is modern times, there are some old traditions that refuse to die. The biggest one is that women are not allowed to go on the fishing voyages. It's not that they're not seen as incapable to fish. They're perfectly allowed to fish in the harbor, to clean the fish, to take care of the children, to manage the household, including the household finances, but they're not allowed on the fishing voyages, which last weeks. And during those weeks, which are quite frequent, Mattea is all alone in her house. She used to go over and spend time with her grandmother, but obviously after her grandmother's death, she doesn't have it anymore. She doesn't really have, she has acquaintances, but she doesn't really have friends, in part because she doesn't have the same desire to leave the village as everyone else her age, so she really doesn't have that much in common with them.
We love thee, we love thee, we love thee, smiling land.
So basically Mattea is left on her own for weeks, and then she'll have maybe a few days with her father, and then he'll be off, and then he has to go off on another voyage. So she's left alone a lot. And it's during one of these times where she's left alone and a ice storm is coming, that she hears someone knocking at the door. Now, of course, realizing that it is pelting icicles outside, and it's quite serious weather outside, she naturally opens the door to let whoever is stuck outside in, and that is when Nagisa falls inside the house. Nagisa being my ice sprite. And okay, I'm going to bring Nagisa onto screen. So doll nudity warning, because Nagisa doesn't have clothes on right now. There we go. So I was kind of planning out some of the mods I want to do on her, so that's why she's nude right now. So as you can see, Nagisa is very strange looking. Oh, if you're wondering what the stuff on her face is, I'm also planning out the face up. So yes. So Nagisa, the ice sprite, ends up living with Mattea, my fisherman's daughter, and it honestly sounds like a sitcom. The best way to describe it is like a sitcom. Nagisa, for whatever reason, was not doing well in that ice storm, and saw that there was a light on in this house, and she actually ends up passing out for a few days. But their relationship is like really weird roommates. Nagisa is very playful, but she's quite the odd character. She really has not interacted that much with humans, and the last time, but she has read up about humans. Unfortunately, all of those records are horribly out of date. And I don't just mean like, oh, they don't have mentions of internet. I mean, they don't have mentions of electricity. I mean that the records are actually about the Aboriginals who were in that area, which, is something they have in common with our world is there aren't any Aboriginals there anymore. What happened in our world is essentially the settlers killed all of them, or they died off from diseases. And that's pretty much what happened in Mattea's world as well. Which ends up being a problem because, as Nagisa is trying to tell Mattea, there was actually an agreement between, like, the spirits of ice and snow and, the people who lived on the island. So they decide that they're going to, refresh the agreements. It's kind of a problem when the people or the nation that you made the agreement with, they don't exist anymore. It's kind of a major problem. So Nagisa is very much a fish out of water. She kind of tried to read up on the people who live on the island, but like I said, everything is horribly, horribly, horribly out of date. And that actually leads to one of the funny little things that ends up happening a lot is Nagisa doesn't actually call Mattea, or even her nickname, Maddie. She calls him Matteus, as in the boy name. Because one of the records that Nagisa's people actually did have was that there were these pale-skinned foreigners who sometimes would come to the island and fish and hunt, but it was only during certain months. So, aka Vinland, aka the Vikings that reached Newfoundland. So Nagisa thinks that Mattea is like a descendant of one of these Vikings, because for whatever reason maybe they made like a year-long settlement. And for that reason she keeps calling Mattea a boy's name. And she really does not ever stop, even when Mattea corrects her, which does lead to some interesting little exchanges, like Mattea going, "Look at me. Do I look like a boy?" And Nagisa looks and goes, "Well, you don't have the body of one, but that doesn't mean you don't have the mind and spirit of one." So as much as Nagisa is a fish out of water, I hope people have some very progressive views. Okay, this is getting really long, so I will make a second video showing off some of the plans that I have for Nagisa's appearance. Okay, bye everyone.